So what I'm going to be doing today is removing the frets from this phenolic fretboard. Phenolic's basically a thermoset plastic, and the frets are put in here fairly normally, but it is a plastic, and as a result of that, there are issues that can come up with it that you might not expect. One of the things that it's fairly good for is that it didn't have a big problem with chip out. But the other things that you've got to be aware of is that it's not going to absorb moisture. There's not going to be issues with respect to, expansion and contraction that you may have with a normal wood. Its tonal qualities are supposed to be pretty good. It's basically a plastic. The only issue that I would be concerned about with respect to this as a fretboard material is the fact that the wood underneath it is real. It's a piece of maple. So that is not going that you're going to have a situation where the fretboard is going to not move. It's going to be pretty inert, whereas underneath it, that wood was going to expand in the summer and basically contract somewhat in the winter, and the piece that's on top can't do that. Anyways, so it's an interesting substance, and this is an occasion to take a look and see how it works when it comes to fret removal. So fret removal basically proceeded fairly normally. I lifted up the end of the fret on the treble side with the fret removal pliers. These are your basic high-end fret pliers. And then I slid a chip stopper underneath each of the frets and slowly, carefully pivoted it up. It came up it was a little tough at the beginning, and then as the fret became more and more removed, the base end of the fret usually came up fairly carefully or fairly well, but you had to be kind of careful at that point in time because there's basically a small piece of fret that's still in the fretboard, and it had to be removed fairly carefully. But normally it just basically went fairly well. So I used the fret removal pliers and the chip stopper to get underneath it, and it worked pretty good. Once I found that the end of the fret could pop up reasonably well with the chip stopper underneath, I proceeded normally. I heated the fret with a soldering gun because I had no idea what was inside of underneath the fret holding the tang in, whether it had glue or something else there. It looked like the ends of the frets had some sort of glue on them. The middles didn't seem to have very much, but one of the things that I was concerned about was, you're basically heating up a fret that's set into plastic, but this is thermoset plastic, and apparently it can withstand temperatures up to 500 degrees, which I didn't think it was going to be getting from the soldering iron I was using indirectly through the fret, but I had to be fairly careful in moving the soldering iron along it to make sure that it would remove the fret. The soldering iron has a groove that is set so that it basically rides the top of a fret. There's a groove cut in it, so it's specifically and only used for fret removal. That's the only reason. That's the only time I use the soldering gun. It's a specialty item, actually. Sorry for the cable being in the middle of the frame. I plugged the soldering iron into a receptacle that's in the ceiling and it hangs down over my workbench. And unfortunately, it's right where the camera was. So my apologies for that. Sometimes the frets seemed to get a little stiff and didn't seem to want to move, and therefore I would heat it up a little bit more. These frets seemed really soft to me. I don't know the quality of them, so when I replace them, I always use high quality Jescar fret wire. It's basically world class. It's the best in the world. So that's what's being used here when I put the new ones back. But these old ones seemed, kind of inexpensive to me. So next, to remove some of the grime that was underneath the frets, I'm going to lightly buff this with 2400 grit sanding pad. This is just to flatten those areas that underneath the frets. Clean the frets out using a fret cleaning tool here. Basically went along here and removed any grunge that was in the fret slots. This is very important, otherwise the frets may not seat properly. So I've got them mostly clean now. A little bit of gunk there. And then I check the radius with a radius gauge, and in looking at this I find that it's 12 inch radius. So that'll affect the radius I put on the frets. It'll affect the clamping that I do when I clamp the frets in, but it's basically a 12 inch radius. So with a small 3-cornered file, I'm going to lightly chamfer the edges of these. The person who refrets these will thank me later. This is an important step, to chamfer with a 3-corner file the tops of the fret slots, because the next person that comes along, when they pull the frets, if these have a slight chamfer on it, it's going to reduce the chance that there be any sort of chip out. So it's really a favor to the person who next comes along and frets this. Just a light transfer of this. So I use this device to put a little less than a 12-inch radius curve onto the fret wire. We'll check it. I want this to be closer to 10, because I want the ends to push down, so that gives me, oh, it's pretty close to 10. So there's where I need it to be. It's pretty good. Should leave the ends pop down. So now, put that wire away. This is 5590 wire, and now need to size it. Start at the bottom. Just gonna do one final cleaning of the frets with my fret cleaning tool to make sure that the slots have nothing in them. Final pass. I've already done this a couple times, but after chamfering, there's a little bit of dust left in these fret slots that I want to clean out. I also want to give them kind of a final inspection before. Put the frets in. So this fretboard is basically effectively bound, and as a result of that, I have to take the ends off of the frets so that they will sit in the fret slot properly, and basically go over the edge. So I'm going to nip off the edge of that. So because the tang ends of this fretboard were filled, it effectively acts like a bound fretboard. So I have to take the tang and make it not quite as wide as the frethead itself. So I do that with these nippers. I take off probably a millimeter off each side so that it'll sit into the fret slot properly. This has to be done for every fret. So 22 frets later. So this is, let's see if I can get this to focus here, nipped off there, and it'll fit in that first fret slot. The fret slot's clean, it has been chamfered. So basically what I need to do now is put in a little high glue. I'm going to use liquid high glue. It's a weak glue, but it's reversible, but it will fill the slots. And okay, so I've got everything all ready. I'm going to put a tiny amount of high glue in this slot. Take my first fret. Still a little high at the top, so I come along with my fret jaws here. So I use fret press cauls that have the same diameter as the fretboard. This is a number 12 radius. There's a little brass insert in there that is going to be a 12-inch radius that I use to press down that fret so that it is going to be snug and exactly where it's supposed to be in that fretboard. It's going to match the radius. So I have to size this, uh, the fret tang, to make sure it fits the slot properly, and I have to keep taking it back, nipping off a little more until it's exactly the right length it needs to be to fit the slot, so that the fret overhangs the bound edges there. Now it's back to gluing with high glue for the second fret. You're going to see that I put in the fret and then I have to clean it up. Because it's a water-based glue, it cleans up pretty easily with water, but I don't want too much water on until I have the fret in. So I kind of tend to clean it off kind of roughly at the beginning, then get the fret in, and then I will basically wash it. This is a leather-backed neck rest there, and I've got that right at the apex so that I'm not doing any damage to the back of the neck, and I'm actually tapping quite a bit lighter than it seems in the video, just enough to seat the fret. Then back to the jaws of life. Try and leave the jaws on while I'm doing the next fret to give the glue just the smallest amount of chance to set up. So I will tend to leave it on. Sometimes I take it off, but sometimes I just leave it on. So with all the frets in, it's important to level them at this point in time so that they're all the same distance from the fretboard. I do this with a leveling beam. This is a straight edge that is I purchased from Luthier's Supply Company. I'm using 400 grit sandpaper on this, which is fairly fine grit because I just want to take off the smallest amount, and I'm using basically no pressure. I'm just moving the beam along and taking the high points off. I can tell that because I marked all the frets with a red marker so that I can see when all of the frets are down to the red has been removed, then they've all reached the same height. Prior to starting this leveling process, it was important to get the fretboard perfectly level. You can see that on the right hand side I've got a notched straight edge that I use to check and make sure that the fretboard was 100% level. This is 400 grit sandpaper. I'm just trying to take off the tiniest amount. And I'm putting basically zero pressure onto this leveling beam. Okay, those frets are now leveled. So I'm not a big fan of the sharp angles in the angling of the fret ends because it takes away too much real estate on the top. But you definitely want something there so that, you know, it's easier to dress and it doesn't end up being a problem. So what I've basically done is I've set a file at an angle of 20 degrees, which is a lot better. This is quarter sawn elm. You can see the grains going through there, so it's nice and stable. Put a file in here, and I can use that to round the edges of these, or take off the fret ends. So I'm going to do that right now, right here. First thing I want to do, though, before I even touch that, is I want to put a piece of tape right along here to protect this, so that if there's a problem with the file, it gives me a bit of a depth gauge. So because this is sort of a bound fingerboard, I'm going to go right to the top. So, see how this works. Very light touch. Decided I wanted to put the same radius on the bottom of this to keep it nice and flat against the fretboard. So I've actually marking the radius, and then I took it out to my table saw and using an operation I wouldn't describe, I basically cut the radius onto the bottom of the block. So I put a radius in this to allow it to sit a little bit better on the board. After I did all this, the very first fret was poking out still on this side, and I can't understand why it was still a little bit proud after going over it numerous times and filing it down so that it would be, flush with the fingerboard there. So once I got the fret ends somewhat dressed, I went back and put another red marker on the tops of the frets to go and just check them over again and make sure that they were still nice and level. Should be able to hear how lightly this passes. It's just to make sure everything is still good, and it's just all the frets have got red mark on the top, and just by lightly going over it, because they're level, that red marker comes off. The fretboard had the tiniest bit of fall off at the end, so I'm just lightly making sure that those frets at the end are level. I'm just dealing with the end frets, probably past the 18th that are just falling off ever so much. So I'm just trying to make sure that everything is nice and neat. So these frets have been leveled. They've been, the ends have been dressed at a 20 degree angle with my little angling little file, radius file thing. So that's been done. I check them by feeling them to make sure that they're not sticking out at all. Well, it might be. Bottom ones feel good. So next thing I have to do is tape it off. So now I have to put the red marker onto every one of the frets to make sure that we can see how that they're crowned. We're going to try and remove with a file these markers to a very thin line at the very top of the fret. With my number 2. Start by giving these a pass with this fret crowning file. It's concave and it rides the top of the frets, but it can't really get the fret narrow enough. So it's just a preliminary way of dealing with the frets and get them sort of a little bit closer to being round. And then I'm going to go on with the triangular file and finish them off. This is a safe edge file. Using a gentle angle, and I'm making it more and more flat as I go across to get to the point where there's just a very fine line that's at the top of the fret, and then the fret is properly crowned. So I'm just leaving a sliver of red here. Right in the center of the fret. Okay, so the neck now has completely crowned frets, and what I'm going to do now is deal with the fret ends. So we're going to basically round over these. This is a long process. The fret end file is again the Japanese fret file. It has a rounded side and a square side. I find that the rounded side works way better because the square side it can dig in. So the rounded side allows me to round over these fret ends just the smallest amount, just to take off that little bit. Polishing these to 8,000 grit. It's really amazing what the difference is between
1500 and 2400. You think it's pretty good at 1500, and then you put 2400 on, and you say, oh, that's pretty good. That's even better. And then you know, put 4000 on, which is what I'm doing here, and you go, oh my gosh, these things really shine. And this continues on the way up to hitting 8000 grit. It's a huge difference in terms of the smoothness of those frets. And a smooth fret is going to last longer because you're not abrading it over, you know, the string isn't abrading it like it does if it hits a rough surface. So it's definitely a good idea. To get your frets polished. The first grits take quite a long time because you're removing all of the file marks and, you know, different things that are on the frets, inconsistencies. But these next ones, they go significantly better. Way faster. But I can still see a difference between this one and this one. This one looks dull and gray by comparison. And that's been the case all the way up the grits. This is a Washburn guitar, and the frets that I took off seemed awful soft. They seemed to kind of peel out like, you know, like solder on a spool. So of course the frets I'm putting in here, you know, world-class Jescar. I think they're 6105s. They're 55 tall and 90 wide. So this, the fret ends of this fretboard were filled at some point in time with some sort of plastic or epoxy, and in cleaning this, the fretboard out, this little piece chipped out of here underneath the 9th fret. So what I'm going to do is, I have some genuine Gaboon ebony that I'm going to put a tiny bit of sanding dust into that crack. It's going to make this stuff is hard. So Let it come back with a drop of super glue. So this will be the only genuine ebony in this fingerboard. It'll probably improve the tone. So I'll let that harden. And then I will pare it down with a razor and buff it up. Okay, this glue is solidified, so I am going to very light sanding with 400 grit sandpaper here, just to get it started. That was 1500. It's 2400. This is 4000. Go to 6000.
Ended up having to go back with a razor blade and then redo the whole process to get rid of that little mark, but it ended up pretty good in the end. I think that's a wrap.